Minus 1 minute. T minus 50 seconds. Seconds. T minus 20 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Ayesha, you're muted.
Good morning and welcome to the Time of the Writer Festival KwaZulu-Natal. The festival is made possible with support from the National Arts Council of South Africa, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, KwaZulu-Natal Department of Sports, Art and Culture, Dramatic, Artistic and Literary Rights Commission, DALRO. We express our gratitude to the 100 writers who are participating in the 2025 edition of the festival. As I mentioned, the 28th edition of the festival. My name is Ayesha Kajee, and I'm facilitating this panel titled Terror and Tenacity in the South African State. And joining me are 3 writers. And welcome to you all. I believe that we're still waiting for Niq Mhlongo to join us, but we have with us already Darlusz Dziewanski, and he is the author of Gang Entry and Exit in Cape Town, the book currently on your screen, being launched next week. I had the privilege of reading an advanced copy. And David's work is titled Lives on the Line. It's in late 1990s to early 2000s. That's the people against gangsterism and drugs. So Dariusz and David, welcome to you both. I am hoping that we will soon be joined by Niq Mhlongo, the author of the fictional The City Is Mine. This is quite a diverse panel, but for me, the points of interaction between all 3 works are the effects of marginalization in urban settings, peripheralization in urban settings, where people living at the margin turn to other forms of power to access control over their lives, be that social power, cultural power, or economic power, and I think predominantly economic and sometimes a form of political power. So Dariusz, to begin with you, your book is an in-depth analysis of how people get drawn into the gangs that have become such a feature of life on the Cape Flats and how they might exit these structures. There's been a lot written about gangsterism on the Cape Flats, about the prison gangs as well as the street gangs. One memorable contribution to this literary archive is Johnny Steinberg's The Number, looking primarily at the prison gangs and their genesis from the early parts of the 20th century. But yours is more an immersive work where you have followed people for over a period of time trying to exit gang life, sometimes successfully, sometimes not that successfully, on the Cape Flats. And you reference a series of in-depth interviews with these people, including, I think, one whole entire chapter in your book dedicated to one former gangster, Gavin. So if you wouldn't mind telling us where the impetus for this research and this writing came from.
Thanks, Ayesha. So as you say, sort of the entry point into the book is gang entry, and there has been a lot written on rural inequalities, marginalization, segregation in a city that's never lived up to its post-apartheid potential, in a country that's never quite done that. How a lot of the structural inequalities and legacies of apartheid remain and disempower people economically. And so to make that connection between the problems people face, the structural inequalities in society, to, I guess, humanize a topic that is often spoken about quite sensationally, quite moralistically. And the way that I tried to write the book, almost sort of personalized element to really provide that element of humanity. And so we're speaking a little bit about this idea of terror and terror and tenacity, I guess. Terror really speaks to kind of the words that are used to describe, I think, gang membership, gang participation. And so why I wanted to bring it back and not to excuse, let's say, participation in gangs and the types of things that happened as part of that participation, but to couch it in a context and a history, and then really to, at the, I guess, halfway point of the book, which there's not a lot that's written on disengagement and exit when you compare it to participation and entry, and definitely within the Cape Townian context, there's not much there. And so I wanted to give some credence to the stories of people getting out, to try and look at, what are some of the commonalities, to potentially even inform programming and policy. And so that's kind of the impetus and the focus of the book.
Okay, thanks for that introduction, Dariusz. I believe Niq is with us. Hello, Niq, and welcome. We're very glad this one I'm holding stances, and I'm pretty sure that catch that all three works are rooted in the peripheralization, the marginalization of some of the poorest communities in our major cities, in your case, Johannesburg, and to a lesser extent, Durban, and in the case of Dariusz's and David's work, largely Cape Town. David, let me come to you next. You were an integral part of the intelligence team that brought down the terror group, what was initially started as a vigilante group, or so most people thought, and then morphed into the domestic terror group, Haggard People Against, through loose cell-based structures, etc. And it's actually, I think, an enormous pity that thus far we haven't kept up that kind of intelligence work to combat, for example, the mass violence that we saw a couple of years ago in July when supporters of then President Zuma rose up and terrorized some of our urban centers once again. So David, welcome to the conversation. And let me ask you, obviously you're having been part of this intelligence network and having been involved in intelligence since your anti-apartheid activism days, formed a very strong impetus for you to write this. But you mention in the foreword that it was a slow process, and that slow process allowed you to reflect, contributed to bringing down Haggard, but also how it was a very much a personal journey of integrating apartheid-era policing and intelligence structures that had a very broadly a kind of Skopskit and Donner approach to one that really appreciated and integrated the intelligence capabilities that you and your team brought.
Hi, good afternoon, Ayesha and Dariusz, Niq. And there were two reasons for that. The first one was that when I initially started writing it, immediately after leaving government, events were very fresh, so there was the advantage of that. But what I lacked was perspective. Which both time and with time, meaning seeing much of the world. I mean, I had worked and lived in Iraq, in Europe, and traveled, and the lessons that one was able to learn and transmit in the book. The book is about, it's about a small group of people, former adversaries. I mean, these were ANC, intelligence and military people, of which I was one, and then there were the old security branch people. And I mean, we used to be out, to kill each other, in very real terms. And we worked together in a team that really produced exceptional intelligence and results. And what I wanted to write about, with the benefit of time then, was not just the lessons that could be learned, but I wanted to write about an example of exceptional intelligence work conducted by Black intelligence officers. Because what we've seen in the last many years is a sort of cynicism about the transformative project in South Africa and the ability of Black people to do exceptional things. Right. And I wanted to write the book specifically to counter that sort of tendency that has emerged, and to show a concrete example of how Black former ANC intelligence officers, together with their former adversaries, produced something really exceptional, and that it can be done, and that it should really be replicated. As you say, it's unfortunate that if we look at July 2020 sort of thing.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's some fascinating, again, sort of little vignettes from your book that we can bring into this conversation. Thank you for that introduction, David. Let me move on to Niq. Niq, yours is a work of fiction, but I'm of the very strong belief.
Thank you, Ayesha, and hello to David and Dariusz. For instance. So you are right, very right to say that I'm sometimes asked by different publications around the world to write about South Africa, more especially Johannesburg. So at some point, I think around 2007 or something, I'm not sure about the years, I wrote a piece for The Guardian because they wanted me to write about Johannesburg, including Soweto, the part of Johannesburg that I come from. And also, then I got asked by also publications such as Stranger's Guide in the US to write about Johannesburg. So I realized that there's lots of interest about this city as one of the most visited places in Africa, for instance, Yes. And I come from there. I've got an intimate relationship with this city. So this is where I, for instance, went to the university schools, and this is where I was born, and this is where I live. And I witness its changes every day. So, those elements were very much important for me when I kept, when I'm asked to write about Joburg. And at some point, I realized that most of these elements are changing. Like, for instance, when I was writing for when I first wrote for The Guardian, for instance, I would include the library, the fact that I used to go to the city library. And by the way, I'm glad that today it's opening its doors, after such a 5
after years. Long hiatus, yes.
Long hiatus, So I realized that I'm including this particular stuff, stuff that made me to be myself as a reader. And also things that me walking around the city around that time, relatively, we know there was crime, but relatively now the crime has risen very high. And I've realized that, okay, when people ask me to write any publication that will ask me to write about Johannesburg at the moment, I'll have to readjust all these things that I know. So when I wrote The City is Mine, for instance, it was that kind of nostalgic kind of kind of tone, because this is the Johannesburg that I missed, And then I tried to make it a point that I write about Johannesburg, the Johannesburg that is at the moment I had to for purpose of the book, I had to stick to the Johannesburg that it is at the moment, the way it is at the moment. And as you said, in your introduction, the marginalization of the people, for instance, because even though I was born in Johannesburg and I think I know the city well, I still feel marginalized being inside the city, because there are certain parts of the city that I cannot go, that I cannot walk freely, that I cannot, with a comparative kind of mind, because I live in Europe at the moment. I live in Berlin, and I travel a lot. So, what I see here and then what is back home, it may and read anywhere you want, without even fearing anyone. The thing that you can answer your phone wherever you are without thinking that somebody might come and snatch it from you. Or maybe if you lost your wallet, anybody can come and say, we got your wallet in here. Yeah, so those are the kind of things that I wanted to bring in and say, okay, right, this will be the Johannesburg that I would love to happen. But in the meantime, it's not like it's there. Perhaps we can use this module and say, what is wrong with our city? So that's exactly how I came about writing The City is Mine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Niq, for that. So I'm going to ask my next question to you first and then go back in almost in reverse order from how I started. So if your book starts off with somebody living a pretty middle-class life in a suburban area with his girlfriend, about to engaged, about to set a wedding date, etc., and then he undergoes a huge betrayal and essentially has to leave that life and becomes one of the city's peripheral inhabitants, one of those that are often unseen by many who inhabit the city. He goes from, as I said, living a comfortable middle-class life to literally sleeping in cemeteries, finding new friendships among the homeless living under Jorrison Bridge, for example, walking the streets of Braamfontein, frequenting, when he has a bit of money, the brothels of Hillbrow, etc., and finding comfort in these spaces as well, and finding community in these spaces, when he's kicked out of his original community, as it were. Did you set out to write about the marginalized, the peripheralized, the largely unseen, but who also then contribute to some extent to the rise of criminality in our urban centers? Or in
Definitely. Thanks for bringing that out. Actually, when I started writing the book, one of the most important things that I had in mind, of course, when you're writing, sometimes you want to write a particular idea, but people pick another idea. So the idea that I wanted people to pick when I was writing this book was the idea that the alienation that happens in the city. And bringing closer to that, it was the idea, the relationship between the city and mental illness, that sometimes the city brings that to you. You are, as much as we love the city, this pollution, the noise pollution, the lack of food, the noises and what can contribute actually to your mental illness. So that's what I was actually I intended the book to be, so that there's too much romanticization actually of the city, more especially amongst us blacks, for instance, who have in South Africa, who have through the design of apartheid, you have two homes. One is in the rural area, one is in the urban area. So the one in the urban area, for instance, is glorified as if this is the place to be, And then, so I wanted to bring in that element as well, that where is home? What is home actually? And then sometimes, and then using my main characters that you are talking about, who are homeless, but they still feel home inside the homeless city itself, So those are the elements that I wanted to bring, but also showing exactly that a city can alienate you to an extent whereby you can start well with the city, but it can alienate you to a point whereby you get a mental illness from the city itself. So that was my intention when I was writing it. And then I just don't know whether that point got across, but actually that's what I wanted to do. Yeah.
You bring about that fluctuating mental illness, if you will, that, at times is very much a very real companion to him, and at other times recedes in the better times that he experiences. So yeah, I think you've certainly succeeded in that, and we could probably have a whole conversation around cities and how they induce mental illness. But so thank you, Niq. And moving on to you, David, when you talk about lives on the line, you also talking about communities, and a specific community particularly that in Cape Town that had a very strong anti-state motive of wanting to establish a so-called Islamic state in Cape Town, maybe in wider South Africa, etc., through Qibla. And you talk about that, about infiltrating that in a very personal way. And you talk about both the successes and the failures of that. But a lot of the impetus for that movement also has its roots in this peripheralization, in this marginalization, in this feeling of neo-apartheid and neoliberalism juggling in the post-94 era, and people trying to find a foothold for themselves in this. How would you react to that comment?
Yeah, I think if one looks at Qibla, which was, the prime formative impulse behind Pagad, obviously Qibla grew in the anti-apartheid struggle when, like all of us, Black communities and that particular community, Cape Town, was a marginalized and a brutalized community.
Mm-hmm.
We then have the transition in 1994 to democracy. But I think what happened here is that the momentum, firstly, of alienation, which doesn't just come to an end because yesterday you went to vote, right?
Yes.
But the momentum of alienation and the momentum of being against the state, that momentum persisted for a while. And then coupled with that, obviously, is the fact that ideologically, Qibla did not accept the new democratic order.
Mm-hmm.
For their own ideological reasons. But the sense of alienation was obviously still there, and the material circumstance of alienation, because people were still living in townships with gangs in a circumstance of extreme violence. Now, one could make the point that, the new government didn't have enough time, obviously, to implement what it committed to do. But that doesn't detract from the feeling of alienation and the material circumstance thereof. And that is why Qibla and Pagad had such fertile ground on which to, from which to recruit and around which to mobilize, and why they were such a spectacular success.
Yes, and how they moved from being or at least being perceived as a broad-based anti-drugs, anti-gangsterism organization to being an anti-state act. Dariusz, to come to you, you also speak about the alienation, the peripheralization, the sort of, again, the neoliberalism on the one hand and the neo-apartheid on the other, in the Cape Flats, in the suburbs, or I don't know if you can call them suburbs, the townships that most of your protagonists come from. I'm calling them protagonists. I know it's not a work of fiction, but you've written it, as you said, very much in a journalistic way. So I think of them as characters.
Yeah, so to pick up on a point that I guess David raised, the alienation and the material exclusion really are sort of the seeds that both make recruitment for an organization like Pagad much easier, and obviously recruitment for organizations like the many gangs that we see on the Cape Flats, very, very easy. So where there are no opportunities or limited opportunities for jobs, limited opportunities for social empowerment, limited basic services. People look obviously elsewhere to organizations that fill the vacuum where the state is unable to. They need economic opportunities to either sell drugs or to be a hitman, for some sort of respect and empowerment. And so in a way, the alienation is almost compounded, unfortunately, because my book looks at gangs like sort of aggression, risk taking, acting crazy. You give yourself a comparative advantage in marginalized communities where resources are scarce, but in the long term, you criminalize yourself. You develop sort of habits that lend themselves towards aggression. Well, obviously, aren't necessarily those that would put you in a position to succeed, let's say, in a long-term relationship or an office setting. And so you sort of compound your own marginality through these antisocial kind of acts and breaking further away from society. But one, I think, interesting thing that I just want to also pick up on in terms of, the city is mine, to kind of weave all of this together. There's closer to the beginning of my book, I talk about the way that space sort of shapes the way that people act. And there's this initial sort of vignette, I guess, of Gavin, who is one of the main protagonists, as you call them, of my book. And this is after, so Gavin, just to give some context, has been a longtime mongrel. He's sort of trying to make his way out of the mongrels and the 28s because he's served, I think it was 13 years in prison for murder, and he's trying to get a job. And so he travels to Tableview. But of course, he doesn't take enough money. He doesn't sort of understand sort of the cultural context of that particular milieu, even though it's in the same city. It's a highly fragmented city. And he's comfortable being in Ottery and some of sort of the surrounding areas like Grassy Park and Retreat because, he knows the space. There's a certain type of cultural capital that's accepted there that he's able to leverage as a gangster. Whereas as he makes his way to Tableview, though he's dressed in a suit, without enough taxi fare to return, he starts asking people to, have some money to help him with some money potentially, to help him charge his phone so he can get in contact with the few resources that he has. And eventually, kind of turn him away. And he sort of exasperated and a bit disheartened says that, if I was a gangster and I called the mongrels and this was about drugs or guns, I'd be able to do it. Or if I was in Ottery or in Grassy Park.
I'd have my social capital.
Exactly. And I'd understand how, because he saw no other alternative and just waited for me at my gate until I returned back from work. And so that alienation is, it's a complex sort of, force, I guess, that works on people in different ways, depending on the same people in different ways, depending on the parts of the city that they're in and how they feel in terms of the structural and social forces that are pushing on them there.
Gavin was, I think, for me, the most interesting character in your book, and I'm glad you focused so much on him. You mention in your book that the sort of three drivers for exit out of gang life, out of that street habitus that you talk about, our family, work opportunities or career, some kind of career beyond them, and spirituality that ran through both Niq's book and David's as well. So I'd like to, just hone in on that for a second, that what serves your protagonists, I'm going to call them again, the gangsters, in their gang life, their social and street habitus, is what actually holds them back in reintegrating into family, in finding work outside gangs, and in accessing their spirituality. And in many cases, they've got to wear that spirituality very openly, very publicly, in order not to be forced back or drawn back towards the gang life and the street life. Of the three, which would you say has had the most impact on exit from gangs?
But in a sense, it also depends on what perspective you long term. Is there ability to access gainful employment, long, consistent, gainful employment. And so on some level, work is central to that exit. But in the early stages, because you are often, in a place where job opportunities are scarce, and definitely in the formal sector, and you've been criminalized, and so you've got, a criminal record. So even sort of menial employment in a place like Pick and Pay will trigger, I'm not exactly sure what the right word is, but flag that your background is one where, up until the point where, the cynicism and the suspicion that people around them, whether it be so what I found really interesting, I mean, we can sort of obviously guess at the ways that family and work and religion would support somebody's gang exit. But what I thought was really interesting is the way that acts as a social indicator, right? So to dress yourself in, as I described, sort of the clothes, the verbiage, the acts of being a righteous man or woman,
carrying a Bible,
carrying a Bible, or going to mosque, signals to people in a way that is understood, although still looked at with a great degree of suspicion, because there's been plenty of those that have abused sort of this, this pathway out. But if you can sort of stay true to that path, and like along that, there are many tests, right? Because you're living in a community where, as I said, we've talked about the marginality that you face, but your gang sees you as a resource. So your own former gang members will try and bring you back in quite manipulatively, right? They'll try and sabella to you and speak to you in gang slang, and I think there are a couple of vignettes in the book that also point to this. And almost defensively, the responses need to be in a way that's like quite exacting and virtuous, and deferential to kind of push back on the brotherhood by saying, no, brother, I'm just going to church. I don't have time to talk. I'm busy with this. And eventually, if people see this for long enough, those tests might stop. Your gang folks might forget about you, or they might die, rather morbidly, but it's a fact of that sort of life and sort of the that you face with exit and disengagement. And it gives you sort of a fighting chance to make it out. And hopefully the professional aspects of your life also coalesce around sort of that, social and community exit, and people start to believe, and, potentially chances or opportunities open up to you. But that's that social element, of that almost cloaking mechanism, that spirituality and work and family work the same way. It doesn't necessarily be that you use spirituality, religion as a cloak, but if you tend to your professional self and your domestic self in a way that's visible to others for long enough, then that also adds to the sort of the acceptance of that persona.
Right. Thank you for that, Dariusz. David, to bring you in here on the issue of spirituality and overt spirituality, and of course the fact that Pagad was formed by Qibla, etc. You speak in your work of the challenge of navigating colleagues from the former era, from the apartheid era, who wore a very strong cloak of religiosity that was morally repugnant for you because of the kind of work they had done largely. And they still wore this very, very obviously and overtly to also some of the people that you did infiltrate within King Qibla and their so-called G-Force and Pagad, etc. I'm thinking particularly of, I think his name was Khalid Johnson, in the sort of first third of your book, where you recruited him or tried service. Would you care to talk about that from the context of both the spirituality or the fake spirituality you encountered among colleagues from the former regime that you had to work with, versus the cloak of spirituality that some Pagad members, as well as, of course, Qibla members and G-Force members, wore themselves?
Yeah. I spent 1 year, more or less, at the crime intelligence headquarters in Pretoria. And the first thing that struck me upon arrival was that the place was very white. I mean, I expected it to be white. I had a few black people who were former security branch people. And the daily meeting, and it would go around the table, everyone would get their chance, until it came to me. And I said, well, I don't pray, and then one of my black colleagues, former security branch, jumps in and says, I will pray for him. he says. Upon which I said, no, I don't need anyone to pray for me. I mean, I found the whole experience quite jarring, actually, because I was sitting with people who used to, go around killing people. And they obviously prayed at that time too. I mean, as they were killing and so on. So there was that, and I found it astonishing that this thing was still happening in 1996, 97.
Yes.
And then go back to when I'm back in Cape Town, I have this person I've recruited. I mean, on the surface, again, a very religious person.
Yes.
I mean, religious people, obviously, also like all of us, we have our faults and our weaknesses and so on. And he had his, which is why he ended up, working for us. What I found interesting was how he remained very religious and very ideologically committed in his own mind, and he would articulate it often to me, for whom he was working as an agent, how he remains committed to the cause and so on, but that for this particular reason he's cooperating, and it was sort of two versions of how people wear their religiosity with all the contradictions that go on, and how they justify their behavior, the behavior that they in other people would find at odds with the religion.
Yes.
So that was interesting. And then to the point about him being sabotaged, I mean, it was a very seminal event or experience in the sense that it set us back several years. And it was plain sabotage by old regime cops, police from the old regime. Some of them were notorious. They were involved, for example, I mean, I mentioned Leonard Niq, who was mentioned in the investigation and sabotaging the work we were trying to do. And they were more keen on us, meaning ANC people now in government, not achieving anything than they were in stopping the violence that was in play in Cape Town.
Yeah, it's a very interesting juxtaposition of two types of religiosity and where that can take you, I think. Niq, to come to you, there's no overt religiosity in either Mangi or Azza or many of the other characters, but there is a vein of spirituality, I think, that pervades the work to some extent, and that's more a kind of personalized. I wouldn't call it religiosity because it's not dogma based, but it is spiritual. That also, pervades particularly Mangi's spirit and his dealings with both his community, the community he finds and integrates into under the bridge to some extent, but still holds himself a little aloof from, and his moral judgments on what they choose to do, for example, stealing shoes from a mosque, but also how he navigates his own entry into petty criminality, if you will. So would you?
Yes, I think you are right. I think the kind of spirituality that I'm thinking, perhaps it's more a bit subtle in these characters. Under the bridge, for instance, is the spirit of Ubuntu. You know? That is the spirit that makes them to know, to support. When we first encounter Mangi under the bridge, he went there because it was raining, for instance, and he didn't have anywhere else to go. Yes. But that spirit of Ubuntu, even with the leader, and in terms of a conversation, a human conversation, because that's what he lacked. Remember, he was always living in a cemetery, and he was alone talking to the dead, according to him.
Yes.
So, but once he went to live under the bridge, that was more of his way of getting in touch with the humaneness and the physical spirit of being able to talk to somebody. Because that, in a way, being able to talk to somebody can be a most important process towards healing, for instance.
Yes.
Because when we encounter him as somebody that has been stripped, of the necessary protective measures by the city itself. So, so these people that are living under the bridge are welcoming him, which is number one spirit of Ubuntu. And, and another spirit that is there, it's a spirit of the Rainbow Nation. You look at the how these people are from. I think some is from Zimbabwe, for instance.
Yes.
And those are the people that make up the city. But they are also from different backgrounds. So irrespective of where they come from, and also the age difference. You look at the other one, for instance, is just 20 or so, and he is over 80. They are able to live with him. He's able to gain something out of them about how to live under the bridge, because he doesn't have that experience that they have. So that is the spirit that is there. But another spirit that I wanted to talk about that I think maybe it's also described in a subtle manner as well is the spirit of home, the spirit of being home. When we look at the concept of home, for instance, when we read the book, we feel that many people ask, why doesn't he go home? Referring to the rural area, and he feels that going home, which is the rural area in a village, it's more oppressive than
almost an admission of failure in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
So the tradition, and in that way, what does he do? He by not going home, he is somehow against the traditional way of looking into what is home. Home is no longer, and what is home? What are your relatives? Relatives are no longer people that are blood related to you. These are the people that you find anywhere, that you have the same energy, of survival. So this is what the rural home becomes an exploitative kind of a home, because they expect him to pay black tax. Black tax in a sense that he has to support whatever he is doing. People that are in the rural,
whoever the extended family are. Yes.
They think they are looking for. They want him to help them traditionally in the spirit of in the spirit of a family home, which is the village, to support them financially. But of which he looks at it and think like, that is exploitative. I'm not going to do that, because the city doesn't allow me to do that. City allows you to find new home, to find new people, and to find new relatives. So that's why he has this person that is so disheartened when one of the people under the bridge is arrested, and also when they try to steal, in a mosque. He's very disheartened, because this is not the kind of home that he expected to be. It's the same as in the village. So he doesn't want that. So that's why he had to leave at some point, and then look for another home, which he finds in a brothel. It's his home as well. So he has different kinds of homes. So home becomes a place where you feel comfortable, where you feel safe, and where you feel fed, and where your spirits are at rest.
Where you're nurtured. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Niq, for that. Before we close, we're coming quite close to closing. I'd like to reflect on one more issue that I think is an unspoken thread to a large extent in all of your works, is the impact of media stereotypes, both of a city and of specific populations within a city. So, in the case of Dariusz's book, the media stereotypes of what the Cape Flats are like, gang-ridden, etc., what gangsters and gangs are actually like as well. In David's work, media stereotypes, and it's an enduring stereotype of how Pagged came to be and what it was meant to do. And in Niq's work, the media stereotypes of what success in a city like Johannesburg actually are, and how much the media actually impacts our own understandings of the city itself and its peripheries and its peripheralized peoples or communities. So I'm going to come back to you, Dariusz, for that one. Would you care to comment on that? And also perhaps a little bit on what the traditional policing or law and order approach has been towards gangsterism?
Yeah, I think I might have alluded to this a little bit earlier, maybe in my introduction, that I tried to write the book in a way that the characters really came out as sort of fully formed humans to understand, what are their motivations and sort of aspirations in joining gangs and participating in different gang activities as they do. And I think that works in contrast to, as I said before, media stereotypes, public stereotypes that often, portray people that are marginalized, that are peripheralized in a very flat sort of manner, that moralize them in a way that doesn't give full appreciation to the context that they live in and the things that they endure. And so again, not to excuse gangsterism, often the violence that's associated with it, but I in addition to sort of the motivations, painting that sort of milieu with all of its texture and color gives you an understanding of the potential and probable failure of law enforcement and hard policing in that context. So to take one very specific example, we have somebody who's synonymously known as Ruin. Right, and so he was a former corner boy, and we have this sort of scene that's described in the book where he's in the Wynberg magistrate's court, and he's been there a number of times, and he's brought up before the court, and the court or the judge asks him, the magistrate asks him, give me one reason why I shouldn't sentence you, and he essentially curses out the magistrate. And in describing this whole situation, he said to me, I knew that this would, and he said, I knew that this would give me a harsher sentence. I knew that
maximum sentence,
against my own sort of good in terms of being able to escape prison, escape a sentence, but it didn't matter because the eyes of potentially everybody that was in the court, because it's kind of a clearinghouse for criminality for many of the communities that are around there, whether it be somebody that either knows him directly or knows somebody that knows him, it's important for him to sort of maintain that front, irrespective of kind of the whether or not this adheres to laws or the social norms of society, and whether or not this is going to make him go to prison and result in punishments, right? And so you can see very easily how gangs and sort of that moral universe works under completely different rules. And so stronger laws, harsher policing, all of these types of things aren't necessarily going to be an effective deterrent, right? I mean, Johnny Steinberg, we're talking about the number, describes this quite well in his book, where the number more so back in the 80s and the 90s when he was sort of researching and writing his book, but still now is seen as a way of gaining credibility. So to go to prison, to get the number, to become a number, it's almost like a rite of passage, right? And so harsher laws, more policing do not necessarily equal a safer society without the redistributive aspects of social reorganization, restructuring, things like this.
Yeah, otherwise there's just an ever increasing pool of potential recruits, even,
Yes.
To replace those who have managed to make their way out.
And also communities themselves are terrorized, right? I mean, communities,
Yes.
not that they don't want policing, it's just the version of policing that they get is a bastardized version that often re-victimizes them. So you see the army roll in as a gang and violence and drug prevention measure and kick down doors based on often very little information. This is a form of terror, institutionalized violence that re-traumatizes communities. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. David, you speak to something similar in, the sort of hard, public order policing that was tried to try and eliminate PAGAD, etc. But I'd also like you to speak a little bit to media stereotypes, because up to today, there are people on the Cape Flats, if you speak to them, who will say that PAGAD was an anti-drugs and anti-gangsterism organization and that it's been unfairly stigmatized as an anti-state actor. So if you would come in on that, please.
I think the first sort of media construction we had to confront, which was very difficult, was the image of PAGAD as a community organization. Now, it was made more difficult by the fact that to many, if not most PAGAD members, this is what the organization was. They, as individual PAGAD members, were involved in anti-crime, anti-gang, anti-drug activity. So, and the media accepted that characterization, which was given by PAGAD, right? And once that momentum started moving, it was difficult to roll it back. I would say impossible, really. Partially because it wasn't just the media. I mean, so-called experts who had, written about it, people who speak on TV about it, had the same view, and so it was given a respectability and a sort of often an academic kind of credibility. So that was the first thing, because in dealing with PAGAD, we had to convince at least the government, in the first instance, that this is not a community organization. And that took a long time. Then, because a large part of our operation against PAGAD was political and ideological, sort of marginalizing it in communities and withering away its credibility, we had to convince communities. So that was it was extremely difficult. The other huge factor in terms of media, and here it's more global media, but it does penetrate to South Africa, we had to deal with was basically Islamophobia and the characterization of Muslims as, inherently threatening and terroristic kind of people.
Yes.
Because as we were struggling to deal with PAGAD and not finding success early on especially, we had all these helping hands, from the US and Europe and so saying, look, these terrorists, they are part of a global project and we are there to help you and so on. And thankfully, we were not too eager to accept this help, And
I must mention, not least Mossad and Israel.
Well, the Israelis were on it all the time. So we partially or mostly, I suppose, because of where we came from historically and ideologically, we knew what this meant and what this was intended to do.
Right.
But so those were two narratives shaped, or transmitted through media that we found really difficult to counter, as it were.
Yes, yeah. And I think it brings out some important elements about how media functions in our current context. Even Niq, coming over to you, and then we'll give each of you just a quick 1 minute last. The margins of the city, people living at the margins, homelessness, brothels, places like Hillbrow, like Braamfontein, like the inner city. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I think, for instance, media, for instance, looks into homelessness, most especially in South Africa, but also elsewhere, as people that are homeless, as people that don't have ambitions, most of them are drug addicts that that will never even, they've been even kicked out of their families because actually they're the scum of the society, But when you look into the book, for instance, what I tried to do, there's one particular character, for instance, who has an ambition of being a professor.
Yes.
A literature professor. He even reads literature under the bridge, for instance, and to such an extent that his ambition of going back to the university makes him to get arrested, because when you are arrested somehow in South Africa, you also given an opportunity to study without even paying.
Yes.
So that's what he does. He uses his intelligence that many people think he doesn't have. Intelligence under the bridge to get himself arrested so that he can be able to study and realize his goal. So he goes to prison because of that. So that's the stereotype that we mostly have. Another stereotype I think that I also want to share is the stereotype of this city of Johannesburg, which everyone around the world thinks like this is the richest place on earth, because it's literally built on top of a gold,
Yes.
And then to such an extent that it encourages people from whichever walks of life to come, So to come to, to South Africa, because they think like there's this claim about this city that everyone can get rich, So that's exactly, when you go there, you realize that actually it is the opposite. You become, the city can either take you or reject you at the same time,
Yes.
So, and also the third one that I wanted to talk about was the issue of how the stereotypes that we have about, prostitution,
Yes.
or as a whole, maybe a brothel, That's not only that. It's not only the place. What I wanted to say is that it's not only the place that sells sex and pleasure, but it's a place whereby people share ideas. You look at how my main character, got his job and his mojo back. It's because he had met somebody in a brothel who told you, "Oh, are you looking for a job? There is so and so that you can employ you." That's how he got back to his feet, and he got employed. Whether the job was totally dodgy or whatever, it's another matter. But he got that job, and then he managed to get himself back to life again. So I was looking into those stereotypes. That these are the stereotypes that perhaps need to be interrogated. When we look into the city itself.
Absolutely. So in closing then, I want to encourage everybody listening and participating, and those who will come to this later, to read all three of your books. Niq Mhlongo's The City Is Mine, David Africa's Lives on the Line, and Darlusz Dziewanski's Gang Entry and Exit in Cape Town. I'd like to encourage you to read each other's work as well, because I think you will find points of resonance. But in closing, any last thoughts, Niq, and then we'll come to you, Dariusz, and give David the last word.
Any last thought? I just want to say thank you to the Time of the Writer. Thank you, Ayesha. And thank you, Dariusz. Thank you, David, for sharing this moment with me. And I'm definitely going to look up to your work and read it. And I'm just saying, please read South African works. There's so much we can get out of that. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Niq. Thanks for joining us from Berlin. And we wish you everything of the best while you're there, but hope to welcome you back home soon as well. Dariusz, over to you.
Also like to express my thanks to you, Ayesha, for reading the works and pulling out some really interesting threads from three very disparate or seemingly disparate works of writing. Thanks obviously to David and Niq. It's been a pleasure having this conversation to the festival organizers. I think it our discussion shows the power of writing in terms of bringing agency to marginal spaces through descriptive characterizations that empower people and shows sort of their struggle against and tenacity against the structures that press down on them in different ways. So thank you all.
Absolutely. And the terrors that pervade their lives. So
exactly.
Not such an odd title after all. Thank you, Dariusz. Over to you, David, for the final word from this panel, and then I'll close.
Great. Thanks, Ayesha, Niq and Dariusz, and to the festival for an interesting conversation. I think that I'd like to close just by saying, for people who read this particular book, I'd like for them to look at it as a sort of a micro example of what is possible, of what can be built, especially in the face of all the cynicism that we're confronted with every day in media. We were just talking about how media shapes perceptions, and that this sort of micro example of exceptional work is something that can, if you invest properly and you have the right people and you give people the freedom to do what they need to do, it can be writ large in building a state, institutions, and a country.
Yeah, thank you for that very hopeful note, David. And I think you're right. I think your book does provide an exceptional example of certainly, Black excellence, Black leadership, but also of a model that can be built under very trying circumstances to successfully accomplish its aims. So thank you for that optimism. I know that all of your books are available through some of the country's largest outlets, exclusive books, but also through some of the smaller independent bookstores like Ike's in Durban, the Book Lounge in Cape Town, and Love Books here in Johannesburg, as well as Jara Books, etc. So I'm not going to ask you where your books are available. I know David's will only be available next month, and I hope to see you at least one of the launches, David. And I hope to meet Niq and Dariusz at some point as well, at least to get you to sign my copies of your works. But we've reached the end of our time. In fact, we're a little bit over time. So I'd like to thank you all for being part of this panel. I'd like to thank Time of the Writer and the technical team and Ismail Mohammed and the curator Shafinaz for this opportunity to facilitate this very interesting panel, as well as with support from the National Arts Council of South Africa, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the KZN Department of Sport, Arts and Culture, Dramatic, Artistic and Literary Rights Organization, DALRO, and we express our gratitude to them as well as to all of the writers, the 100 writers or so who are participating in this 28th edition in 2025. Thank you once again to all of you, and thank you to the behind-the-scenes technical team who made this a seamless session. And once again, to you, David, Dariusz, and Niq, thank you so much for your time, your energy, and your engagement with the various topics we've had in this session today. I do appreciate you all, and thank you very, very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.